I wanted to talk a little bit about the student evidence for the social studies lesson. Unfortunately, the day that I actually did my lesson, the students brought down their clipboards and they took notes on the clipboards on loose leaf, and I did not collect their sheets at the end of the lesson, but I did have some notes written down of certain things they said during the lesson, things that stood out to me, and if you could go to my student reflection page, there's also there's a video clip of one of the students talking about the lesson as well. One thing that stood out to me in terms of some of the ways that the students wrote down their thoughts were that some of them actually wrote out paragraphs about their institution. They started to actually write a little summary about that institution. One student in particular that I can think of, she had government as her institution, and she was kind of just listing things. I noticed that she was starting with the local government, so she had things like the governor, mayor, and courthouse. And one thing that I got her to start thinking about was thinking about the large forms of government. I think that something that she was doing really well was that she was thinking just about her community, her immediate area, Philadelphia, Pennsylvania, which was something that a lot of the other students did as well, but they did also discuss how their institution existed beyond their immediate area. So this student, after a while, after she had some more time to think about it, she eventually added things like the president and the vice president. She didn't put the Senate, but she did make reference to the fact that the laws do have to be made by a certain group of people. Another thing that I thought was interesting was the student who talked about economics. That particular student happened to be my child studies student, and when he started talking about economics, the first thing that we talked about as a group was a recession, because that is something that they're seeing and hearing a lot about right now, and it's right in front of them. One thing that he started to say in his discussion about economics that I found really, really interesting was that he said that in a recession, it's where families lose their jobs, and as a result lose their house, lose their car, they lose things. And it was interesting because when he said that, the students started to talk about the connection between the institutions. And for example, with economics, there's a direct connection between economics and families. So I asked him the question of, along the lines of who do parents work for? And the students responded, companies. So then we got into a new discussion about companies and about consumers. They didn't know the actual word for consumers, but there was one student who did guess it and told the other students. But it was interesting because they started to think about the fact that families in the recession happens as a result of businesses, and businesses or companies are places where the parents work. So when those businesses do poorly, their parents lose their jobs, and in turn they can lose their home, and that can affect their education. One student talked about the fact that sometimes students go to public school or sometimes they go to private school. So we had a discussion about in the recession how maybe some families were no longer able to send their students to a private school, and thus now they were going to a public school. And then this one particular student saw the connection between that and his institution, which was education. So after we talked about economics for a while, we moved on directly into families. And the way that I did it is we went around in a circle. And so we did economics, family, education, religion, and government. So the next student that talked about families, he kind of had already a little bit of a foundation to talk about that because we had talked about the recession. One thing that he said that I found really interesting was that he said that families are all different, and he didn't exactly say explicitly what he meant by them being different, but I assumed that to be, he recognized the fact that not all families may be the same. In other words, maybe kids aren't raised by two parents. So I thought that was really interesting that I found that to be kind of a mature response to that, which could be attributed to the fact that they are in upper elementary, they are in middle school, so I think now they really are grounded in the idea that not all families are the same. And after we talked about families, again, the students made another connection into education. When we talked about education as an institution in Paris, one thing that the students were really surprised to find out about were that the students that are their age, living in France, they actually go to what is called college when they're 20 years old. So one of the first things that student talked about who had education was that he said there was a difference between students here and students there, and that here you don't go to college until you're 18, but in Paris you go to college when you're 12. But he also, another aspect that I found to be really interesting about this student who had education was that on his paper, he started to kind of write the hierarchy of education. He didn't know the word hierarchy, but that's, to me, when he was sharing it, that's what he was showing, because he was saying that, well, first you go to preschool, and then maybe you go to kindergarten, and then I asked him, well, where are you guys right now? And he said, we're in elementary school. And I said, what's after elementary school? And he said, and there's high school, and then college. And then another thing I found to be interesting about him in particular is that on other occasions he's alluded to what happens after college, because the students sometimes ask me if I'm in college or if they know that I'm in school. So I told him one time that I was in grad school, and he hadn't heard that term before, but he had mentioned wanting to go to law school, and so I explained to him that law school was grad school. So that particular day, when he started talking about education, he said that some people choose to go to law school or to go to medical school. I can definitely see that he is a student who's thinking ahead, and he's mentioned wanting to go to law school, and so I think that he kind of has this innate understanding of education not being just one period in time, but it being something that builds and builds and builds, and so there's a structure to it. And then after we talked about education, we moved into our discussion about religion. I think that of all the institutions was the hardest one for the students to talk about, because they realized that here in the United States, in American society, there are many religions that are recognized, whereas when we were talking about Paris in the beginning of the lesson, one of the first things I said was that France as a whole, in France there was a very large concentration of Catholicism. And at one point on her paper she wrote Jewish. She didn't write Judaism, but one of the other students saw her writing it, and then they almost started to have a little tiny argument about whether or not someone who was Jewish whether that was an ethnicity or a religion. So that was one of the first things that I touched upon when we came back together as a group. We talked about that, and I explained to them that I had friends who were either devout followers of Judaism, or I also talked about my friends who were Jewish but who are not religious. So we kind of got into this discussion about religion and about the different forms of religion, and I think they started to see it a little more, but I think definitely that was a harder topic. And then finally we ended with government. So I thought the students had a very rich discussion, and I thought that was definitely the most interesting part of the lesson for me, to see how they thought about these 5 institutions.